It's been 8 months since Scottish Secretary Alistair Jack blocked Scotland's controversial gender reform bill.
Yeah, the legislation sought to make it easier for trans people to change gender in the eyes of the law. But instead, it launched a huge and heated debate. Now, Scotland reporter Tony Maguire recounts the disputes that led to Holyrood facing off with Westminster.
On the 17th of January this year, for the first time since the Scottish Parliament reconvened in 1999, the UK government signed a Section 35 order, blocking the Gender Recognition Reform Bill from attaining royal assent, despite gender recognition being devolved to Scotland. The Scottish Government had sought to speed up the process that issues only 30 gender recognition certificates each year by making it easier for Scots to self-ID. But after weeks of speculation since the passing of the bill, Scottish Secretary Alistair Jack announced that he would block the controversial reform for its incompatibility with the UK Equality Act.
I have not taken this decision lightly. The government has looked closely at the potential impact of the bill, and I've considered all relevant policy and operational implications together with the Minister for Women and Equalities. And it is our assessment that the bill would have a serious adverse impact, among other things, on the operation of the Equality Act.
That evening, Social Justice Secretary Shona Robison stood before the Scottish Parliament, putting into words the government's collective shock and disappointment.
Preventing the Gender Recognition Reform Bill, which was passed with an overwhelming majority from proceeding to royal assent, is a dark day for trans rights and a dark day for democracy.
The GRR bill took 5 years to pass through the Parliament, at all times met by frequent opposition, including the largest SNP rebellion in 15 years of government. Concerns underlined women's safety in single-sex spaces and the risks of lowering the age of self-ID from 18 to 16. Susan Smith was a constant in that opposition. Leading Campaign Group for Women Scotland, she believes the GRR bill is a threat to women's safety.
What we ended up with was a bill that was very similar, in fact, to the one that had been proposed 5 years before. So despite all the discussion and all the conversation, nothing really got resolved. And our main concern, obviously, as women's rights activists, was the knock-on impact on women's services and spaces.
February saw the shock resignation of Nicola Sturgeon at the height of a reignited self-ID debate, following the chaotic incarceration of transgender double rapist Isla Bryson. Humza Yousaf emerged victorious from the SNP leadership race to replace her. And just 2 weeks after being sworn in as Scotland's 6th First Minister, he submitted a legal challenge to fight the Section 35 order. 5 months on, each side remains steadfast and vocal. But the time has now come to listen, as the final word of the future of the Gender Recognition Reform Bill is decided by the Scottish courts. Tony Maguire, GB News.
And we speak now to former Community Safety Minister Ash Regan, who quit her ministerial role in protest against Holyrood's gender reforms. Thank you for joining us on the show today. Can we start, please, with what was it about this bill that moved you so strongly that you decided to resign from your position?
Yes, so I was formerly the Minister for Community Safety. I was taking forward a number of policies designed to improve the protection of women and girls' rights. And so, in my view, there was no way that I was ever going to vote for anything that I felt had negative implications for the privacy, dignity and safety of women and girls. I believe that this bill was very flawed, and that despite the fact that we did spend hours scrutinising the bill, many of the issues with the bill are still unresolved. And
it's a strong thing to do, to resign from your post. To the public, from the outside at least, this issue drove a coach and horses through the SNP, the biggest revolt in its history. Huge public backlash to the jailing of Isla Bryson, the double rapist. And yet the SNP are still pursuing with this, now set to go to court with Westminster. Why are they so obsessed with an issue which is so hugely divisive?
Yes, it certainly became quite a contentious issue, and you're right to say that it was a rebellion with a number of, myself and a number of colleagues, both in my party, but there are also colleagues who rebelled in other parties across the Scottish Parliament as well. I think this did particularly crystallise in the mind of the public around about the time of the case as you rightly say, of Isla Bryson. I think this is brought home very much to the public that someone could be a double convicted rapist, could decide that they wanted to self-identify as a woman and then end up being transferred into the women's prison estate. And we should also remember that many of the women who are in the female prison estate have suffered trauma. Many of them have had head injuries, for instance, from domestic abuse. And so putting these vulnerable women in that sort of situation, I don't think that's acceptable.
What about the campaigners who say that trans people, they're on a heck of a journey themselves, and actually what this bill will do will make it make the process much easier for them to be legally recognised, and it will be much more respectful for them and straightforward?
Well, of course, everybody wants trans people to be able to live their lives with dignity and respect. That's what I want. I think most people would agree with that. We obviously have protected characteristics. Sex is one of those. Gender reassignment is another, and that's under Equality Act legislation. So everyone at the moment has their rights protected. What we needed to see with the gender recognition reform was an ability to consider and balance all of those rights, and I think that's potentially where the problems arose. Their rights were not being balanced. I would say that the legislative process that the bill went through, I think there was issues with that process. There was certainly a reluctance, or we could even say refusal, to engage with some substantive issues around the legislation. And one of the main ones that I'd point out there would be the potential impact on women and girls and their safety. And another one was very late engagement on things like the cross-border issues. So the Scottish Government doesn't have to take this course of action. Obviously, they're choosing to take this legislation to court, and they don't have to take that action. My view on that would be that this is an issue that we've created in Scotland, and that actually we should be seeking to amend the bill. We should be seeking to resolve those issues in Scotland, as indeed the Scottish Government has done on other pieces of legislation. So there's another piece of legislation which is incorporating the rights of the child, and that's incorporating that into Scots law. There have been some issues with Westminster on that piece of legislation. And in that case, the Scottish Government has decided to reflect on that and is seeking to amend the bill.
And Ash, estimates out there, the cost to the taxpayer of taking this to the Supreme Court could be £500,000 and rising. Professor Tompkins, who's a Supreme Court advisor, said the Scottish Government's decision is manifestly, transparently and obviously being done for political reasons, not legal reasons. Is this even about trans rights anymore, Ash, or do you think this is actually Holyrood trying to go to war with Westminster?
Well, obviously this is happening under the devolution settlements. You'll know that the operation of that is governed under the Scotland Act. That was from 1998. You know, I'm no fan of devolution. It's not really a secret. I would like Scotland to be independent. I would like us to be in charge of our own affairs. So I think if this is a law that we are looking to put forward in Scotland, we should be able to take control of that process. We should amend it here. Taking it to court is obviously one option. It's not the one that I would pursue, and certainly not on this issue. If you look at the opinion polling on this, you'll see that this piece of legislation is deeply unpopular with the Scottish public. I wouldn't be able to make an estimate of how much this court case will cost. I'd defer to other people who would know better on that than I would, but I would imagine this will be a significant cost to the taxpayer, and I think many people across Scotland will be looking at this and they'll be asking themselves, is this a good use of public money at a time of a cost of living crisis?
Okay. Ash Regan, thank you. Well, we can speak to the founder of inclusion and belonging consultancy See Change Happen. That's to get the other side now from Joanne Lockwood. Joanne, good afternoon. Thanks for talking to us on GB News. Ash was claiming that most people in Scotland don't want this, and taking this action is a waste of taxpayers' money. What's your response to that?
I don't have the exact stats on how many people are for or against it. What I can say is that the the impact over the last 5 or 6 years since I think Theresa May government started investigating gender recognition reform is we've seen a lot of negative rhetoric being piled on against trans people. Some of the comments that Ash made just then were really highlighting some sound bites and some sort of dog whistles around how trans women are seen. We never reflect on the impact on trans men. So yes, there has been a swing away from trans rights and trans acceptance by the public due to the negative briefings in the press and the media, and I would say largely the way the UK government are tackling these challenges. And we saw that most prevalently in the Tory leadership competition where Liz Truss took over, where it was a race to be who was the most trans critical, seemed to get the most votes. And in fact, one candidate, Penny Mordaunt, was seen to be trans positive and driven out because of that.
Joanne, it's fair to say, when you look at the numbers of trans people in Scotland, it's about 26,000 in total versus 2.8 million women. And we heard there the case of Isla Bryson brought into stark relief the issues facing women around their own personal spaces and their safety being encroached upon. What would you say to people who said we all agree trans rights are human rights, but trans rights seem to be surpassing women's rights?
Let's not forget there are trans women and trans men and people who identify as non-binary. Nobody is trying to suppress anybody's rights. You know, if you look at a trans masculine person, they're assigned female at birth. What about their rights? The focus seems to be on the demonisation of trans women, and that seems to be the focus. And I do accept, that there are cases, there are minority cases of individuals like Isla Bryson that could be thrown up in the media saying, look, this is what happens when we allow trans people to live freely. There's a danger here that we use one example and then tar the entire trans population with that one person. We saw a nurse convicted of multiple murders of babies. That doesn't mean to say that every woman is a baby killer. Not every trans person is a threat to women. And I, as a woman, as a trans woman, fully support protected spaces for women, for me as well. I want to be able to go about my life without predatory men, without people we see in the media. There's more cases of metropolitan police attacking and raping women than there are trans people in the country. So again, we're picking up on this sort of kind of availability bias where we're picking on these small minority cases and then applying that rhetoric to everybody as a kind of a threat to women and girls. And I think that is largely unfounded, whipped up by the mainstream media and amplified by our government.
OK. Joanne Lockwood, good to hear your thoughts this afternoon. You're from See Change Happen, the founder of Inclusion and Belonging Consultancy.
Yeah, it's a very interesting debate, that one, and one that no doubt will rattle on, especially with this legal case in the offing. Huge case.
I want to know what would happen at the border if this bill goes through.
Yeah,
Get to Berwick, what do you have to do?
Well, and there's a political...
There's going to be gender police at the border?
Yeah,
who knows?
Well, but there's a political ramification because Sir Keir Starmer seems quite keen on adopting the SNP stance. So this will go mainstream after the next general election. You watch.